This woman was in a bit of a tough spot socially. You know, nowadays, most of the time people don't even blink when somebody has been in a bunch of marriages or a bunch of relationships. Or especially people today don't really get concerned when someone is living with someone that they're not married to. But at the time that this was written, not only do they recognize that that's damaging, not only do they recognize that that's harmful to a person, that is not the best that God is calling them to be in, and it hurts. There's wounds that are deep in somebody when they're putting themselves in that kind of a situation. But not only do they recognize that, but they also just kind of publicly shamed people who outwardly had sins that made them to be easy targets in the community. And that's one of the things that Jesus criticized the Pharisees about, because they focused so much on the outside of looking holy, and yet what Jesus says to them is, you are a bunch of whitewashed tombs. You look great on the outside, but inside is a bunch of dead bones. Jesus is not just concerned with the inside. He also wants his grace to be working in us and his holiness to be working in us in a way that goes out from the inside and is displayed by us doing holy good works that only are accomplished by allowing God to accomplish his will in us. But this woman was in a position. You ever heard the phrase, a watering hole? Sometimes people apply that to like the local bar or whatever, but the phrase comes from this. At this time, there's only one spot to get water. Unless you happen to live near a river, then that's going to be the spot. But unless you live near a river, the only spot to get water is going to be the community well. And the women of the community, back then there were clear gender roles. The men worked themselves to death and died at 40, and the women kept on going. But the women did things like baking all day. I don't understand how in the world they, how in the world did anybody live past 30 in a day where, hey, I want lunch. Okay, I got to start lunch at 4 in the morning when I slaughter the goat. It's just a hard living. But the women of the community would come to the well early in the morning and they would draw water. And that would be the water that they would be using all day. I mean, it's like all the women must have been like Xena, warrior princess, because they're carrying just a ton of water back, because they don't want to be running back and forth all day. So they're getting literally the whole day's worth of water for drinking, for bathing, for eating at this well. But when the Samaritan lady that's speaking to Jesus here, when she shows up, when you get anybody together, there's going to be somebody that gossips. And when you have a situation where everybody has to go early in the morning, why early in the morning? Because you're living in the desert and you don't want to get out there at noon when it's overwhelmingly hot. It's kind of like in Texas, you don't mow your grass at 2 in the afternoon. You either do it at 9 in the morning or 9 at night. And then you cover yourself in bug spray. She was ostracized from the community. Because if she showed up early in the morning when everybody else was showing up, they would talk about her. They would gossip about her. They would make mean comments to her. They would shame her. And they would just be casting looks of scorn at her. And her whole time there would just be a reminder from other people about how broken she was. And some people, just get their kicks tearing down other people. And so it's a big deal that this woman is showing up in the middle of the day to get water. It's a big deal in two ways. One, it means that she's obviously so hurting and broken inside that she does not want to be around the other people, but it also means that she is alone. She doesn't have friends. She doesn't have a support system. She doesn't have people in the community who love her. She's alone. And so Jesus shows up and starts talking to her, and she's like, don't you realize that there's two things wrong with this? One, I'm a Samaritan. And two, I'm a woman. Why are you talking to me? And Jesus says to her, can you give me some water? And she's like, you don't have anything to get your own water. What in the world are you doing here? And he says, look, if you knew who I was, you wouldn't be asking me, where do I get my water? You'd be asking me for the water that I can give you. And so you see something here. Because what she's gone through, you can just imagine the heartache of somebody that has been from relationship to relationship to relationship, 5 marriages and divorces. And that's not, it's not saying that to shame her. It's just think about how much pain is involved in one divorce. And she has been in 5. And reading this, I'm reminded of the people that I've known, whether some of them have been family members, some of them have been friends, who have been in abusive relationships. And they go from one abusive relationship to another, and to another. Why? Because inside, whether it's because of the way other people have treated them or because of something else, inside they feel so worthless. They don't feel priceless. They don't feel beautiful. They don't feel cherished. They feel like they literally have no value, and so they seek out those who will treat them the way they feel on the inside. I mean, you got some people who walk around thinking that they're the greatest thing on earth, and they seek out and find somebody who treats them as if when they walk, rainbows burst out behind them. But for people who have been battered, people who have been torn down, people who have been deeply wounded and hurt, some of them begin to embrace this idea that they have no value, and so they find people who will treat them as if they have no value. And she's obviously found several people who don't love her, who don't cherish her, who aren't willing to stay by her side in the hard times, and that's got to send a message to her that you're not worth me staying around when things get tough. And so 5 marriages into it, and now she's living with someone she's not married to. And you can imagine the heartache. And Jesus says to her, if you knew who I am, then you would ask me for living water. And she responds and says, tell me how I can get it. And she gives 2 reasons. So I won't be thirsty, and I won't have to come back here. Sometimes what we want for ourselves is not good for us. You ever realize that? Some of the very things that we ask God for are not good for us. She wants to be in a position where she never has to go back to the community well. But that's not good for her. What she basically wants is for Jesus to invent in the 1st century indoor plumbing, so that she is the only house in the neighborhood that has a spigot. And then, of course, everybody would probably burn her as a witch because she can turn this little handle and water comes out of a pipe or something. But she wants to be in a position where she's the only one in the community that doesn't have to go to the well for water. But you know why that's not good for her? Because if by a miracle she had indoor plumbing, she would still be hurting and broken, and then she would be a hermit, secluded even more from the community, with even more of an obstacle. Now I don't even have to go outside my doors. Now I don't even have to go and chance that there's somebody on the street that's going to treat me meanly. Yeah, but you're also not chancing that there's somebody that's going to show you love. And what I really want, Lord, is that I can stay in my house and pretend that I am okay, that I'm all right, that everything is just fine. What she wants for herself is that Jesus would change her circumstances. But even if Jesus changed everybody else so that no one gossiped about her, no one said anything mean to her, and everyone said positive and loving things to this woman, even if God changed everybody else, she is still the same. And so what she wants for herself, on the surface sounds good. Oh Lord, make it to where I don't have to be here anymore. And we've probably all prayed something along these lines. Lord, you know that every time I see my coworker, it's just like they have the purpose of their life is to say something critical about me. So Lord, fire them. Get them to transfer to Siberia. Lord, move them away from me so that I don't have to hear snide comments anymore. Lord, you know that in this situation, these things are happening. So change the situation. Change it to where nothing makes me feel broken. Lord, make me feel better. That's just it's a long way of saying, make me feel better, Lord. But what God knows, which we often are so blind to, what God knows is that if God only changes our circumstances, it won't be too long before we ask God again, Lord, change my circumstances. Because circumstances will break. It doesn't matter if you are good. It doesn't matter if you're holy. It doesn't matter if you murder people and sell drugs on Thursday. It doesn't matter. People will mistreat you in this life. And if God fixes one group of people that mistreats you, at some point you will find somebody else who mistreats you. And even sometimes people that you love and are friends with, they will go through a time where then they turn around and mistreat you because they're going through a hard time in their own life. And if you really want the Lord to put you in a position where you will never be made to feel bad, then you're asking that the Lord would cut you off from all of humanity and make you alone. And then you're alone and broken, rather than with others and broken. But Jesus wants something different here. What Jesus wanted and what this lady wanted were different. Fundamentally different. Which is why Jesus says to her, see, she wants it to be where there's no one who will ever make her feel shame. And Jesus responds by highlighting the reason she feels shame in the first place. Jesus apparently didn't go to seminary. And Jesus did not take a public speaking course, because that's one of the things that they would tell you is don't talk about the elephant in the room, leave it alone. And Jesus says to her, yeah, go call your husband. I want to talk to him. Hold on. I don't know you well enough. He's working for UPS. He's really busy at the time, you know, like he doesn't get home till 10 o'clock at night, you know. I don't have a husband. I know you don't have a husband. I know you've had 5 husbands, and I know that the person you're living with now is not your husband. In church, we think that if we don't talk about sin, that everybody will come and the Lord will magically heal. But Jesus sits there and says to a woman to her face, you go bring your husband to me, because I know that you're broken. I know that you're hurting. What Jesus wants for her is not to remove anything that could remind her of her brokenness. What Jesus wants for her is to take away her brokenness. What Jesus wants for this lady is not to force it to where no one will ever treat her in a shameful fashion. What Jesus wants for this lady is that she doesn't have a reason to feel shame anymore. What Jesus wants for this lady is that she can go to the community well early in the morning when everybody is there with her head held high, because who they are mocking and who they have scorn for is not her, it's who she used to be, but somebody different is there now. And what Jesus wants for her is that she doesn't have to hide, because she's made whole and healed, and God has done something wonderful in her life, and she doesn't have a sin to be ashamed of anymore. And she can stand there and say, I'm free. He wants living water in her, a never-ending supply of the grace and the wholeness of God in her. What she wants is temporary. She'll still be hurting tomorrow. She'll still be hurting the moment the conversation is over. But what Jesus wants, and oftentimes Jesus does this the very way we don't want him to do it, he draws a focus to the very source of our brokenness and says, this is what it is. He doesn't cover it up. He doesn't make excuses for it. And he also doesn't beat us down and shame us over it. He says, this is who you are. But if you knew who I am, then who you are, would be changed. It'd be different. It would be new. And something happens to this woman. She gets into this argument with Jesus. Isn't it amazing how we like to argue with God? The Lord says, where's your husband? And she says, I don't have a husband. And then she goes into this debate about whether you're supposed to worship God on this mountain or that mountain, because the Samaritans refused to follow the Old Testament law of worshiping at the temple in Jerusalem. So they made their own little place for God and said, no, we're going to worship God where we want to worship God. And Jesus just cuts through it and says, there will be a day when there is no mountain upon which God is worshiped, but each one of us will worship God where we are at in spirit. That's what we like to do sometimes. Lord draws attention to something that we've got to let go and we've got to change, and we're like, Lord, hold on a second. Let me talk to you about this other thing. And Jesus says, that's irrelevant. I'm cutting through that. I'm getting to the heart of this thing. And then she says, well, if the Messiah was here, he would explain it. And he looks at her and says, who do you think you're talking to? It's me. And something happens here in the rest of the chapter. You see, this woman avoided the community well because she had a lot of attention, negative attention. You ever avoided going somewhere because you knew that you would be the centerpiece of attention and it wouldn't be in a good way? Yeah? That's what she was doing. And all of a sudden, Jesus does something in her, and she forces herself to be the center of attention. This woman that hid from the public suddenly goes into the village and starts going to every single house and door and shouting, come and see the one who told me all my sins. What in the world kind of evangelism is that? Come and find the God who highlighted everything I'm doing wrong. And she's excited about it. She's happy about it because when the Lord showed her what was broken, only then was she able to be free. And all of a sudden, this woman that everybody mocked and laughed and she avoided is suddenly drawing all kinds of attention to herself and saying, come and see, come and see. And they go, what in the world has happened here? That she would make it to where we are focused on her when she's been trying to avoid us focusing on her forever. And they go and they see Jesus. And at the very end of the chapter, they say to her, look, we don't believe anymore because of what you said. We believe because of what we have seen. And this woman who was so filled with shame and did everything she could to avoid a reminder, to avoid the community, she becomes the messenger of hope for everybody that made her feel hopeless. Everybody that put her down needed Jesus like she needed Jesus. And she, the broken woman, Jesus, and brings the message to them. The woman evangelizes those who thought they didn't need to be evangelized. What an awesome God, and what an awesome irony. That those who thought they were better than her are suddenly worse than her because she is free and they are not. And she goes and says, come and see. You see, this Lent, we're talking about why does the cross still matter in 2017? Because if all that we are doing is just having a memorial service, if all that we're doing is just remembering a historical event of Jesus did this specific act 2,000 and something years ago, if that's all that we are doing, then we have lost the purpose. Why does the cross still matter? The cross will matter as long as there are still broken people. As long as there are people who are still ashamed of their pasts, ashamed of sins that have a hold over them, as long as there are people who have a sin that has a hold over them, as long as there are people who go from relationship to relationship to relationship because they feel worthless, and maybe if I find the right guy I want, but in reality I'm picking out the very people that are bringing me down, as long as there are people on self-destructive paths, as long as there are people who are scorning and mocking others, as long as there are people who draw breath, there will be a need that people have to be made whole again. And what Jesus does on the cross is not just say your sins are forgiven. What Jesus does on the cross is he creates a path for us, not just that our sins could be forgiven, but that we could be healed and set free from the power of sin and the shame that goes along with it. All of us have sinned. And yet even me who has sinned can stand with my head held high, not because I am good, but because my God looks at me and doesn't say, let me tell you all the things that you have done wrong. I can stand with my head held high because God looks at me and says, I have separated your sins from you as far as the east is from the west. And I don't look at you and see what I found. I look at you and I see what I've made. And Ephesians says we are the masterpiece of Christ. Christ takes the dumpster of our life and makes a masterpiece out of him. This morning, I don't know where you're at. You come play something for us. I don't know where you're at. But I know Jesus. And if you're hurting, or if you're broken, or if you're feeling shame, or you just feel like every time you try to think differently, somebody is there reminding you of everything that you've ever done wrong, you don't have the strength to fix yourself. And you don't have the strength to heal yourself. You don't have the strength to free yourself. But Jesus does. And with Jesus, you never have to be ashamed. And with Jesus, you never have to kind of lower your head and avoid attention. And with Jesus, you never have to work so hard at avoiding anything that reminds you of who you used to be, because that person is a stranger. It is a dead man in the grave, and you can be something